It is difficult for people to tell what is good and what is bad when they do not have the frame around it. For example, if you were to find an old battered painting in the back alley someplace that has been discarded, it would be difficult for you to tell that it's a good painting if you saw the same painting hanging on the walls of the Museum of Modern Art, all cleaned up, well lit with the proper lighting. You would know it's a good painting. There would be no doubt in your mind. And if you didn't like it, you'd know there was something about it you should like anyway. You might put it down, but you'd feel sneaky about it. And so these are all the little problems. When a man walks into a Broadway theater, any kind of a theater really, but a Broadway theater in particular, he is walking into a whole tradition. He is walking into a building that has a long history behind it. Now, it might come to pass that what he sees on the stage has no relationship with that history. Yet he confuses the two. This is all part of the problem of perception. On the other hand, it is all well and known, and I'm certainly the first to admit to you, that radio is largely pop. But we know it's pop, you see. So then we have put around radio the aura of pop, that whenever we walk into the radio loudspeaker, whenever we walk into the sound radius of a loudspeaker, we automatically assume we're listening to pop, unless, and this is the important unless it happens to be a record being played by someone who is from another medium which we respect. And so if you hear Bertrand Russell speaking, we respect his medium. He writes books. And then what he is saying is important because it's coming out of the loudspeaker. In spite of being on the radio, it is important because he's really representing another medium. And if we hear Olivier reading a poem badly, it doesn't matter. And by the way, he often does. I have heard some records he has made of poetry reading. I must go on. I'm the minority here, dissenter. He's a magnificent actor, but he often reads poetry very badly. If we hear Olivier doing it, we are automatically impressed because it is Olivier, and he's from another medium that we respect. I'm saying if it comes out of the radio. If you hear Charlie Brown reading poetry, just a name, but who happens to be far better at reading poetry than Olivier, we have a tendency to put it down because it is the radio and we don't know the man. There's a fascinating little comment that was made to me about 6 or 7 weeks ago by a reader who was commenting on a bit that I did on television. And he said, he says, I've been reading the TV critics, and he says, one of the critics made a big deal about Ernie Kovacs doing something on the television. And it was supposed to be such a great, wonderful, creative thing. And he said, you had done the same thing about 6 or 7 weeks before, but nobody commented on it. He said, the problem here was that it was old friendly Ernie that everybody knows. And so you could accept it from Ernie. In short, the frame was proper. We know that Ernie's a real man. We know that Ernie is funny. And so what Ernie does is just one of our friends dropping in to do this funny thing. He says, however, you are unknown to the critics. And so what you do is suspect automatically. And that's a very interesting point. Now this gets on to George Kaufman. Now, you want to hear about Kaufman? This is all part of the Kaufman story, so quit getting on the stick, you idiots. Listen to the preface, will you? Quit calling up. Tell him about Kaufman. No, I'm telling you about Kaufman. Now listen, will you? Now, and the next one that calls, stay listening, will you? Cut out the jazz. Quit calling. Now Kaufman, I want to tell you about Kaufman. I arrived in this town a completely unidentifiable object. Most of us need identity, you see, to tell what's good or bad, especially if we're official people. The official people are very apologetic about letting other people in other mediums know that they think what they do is interesting. Well, I was here about 2 weeks. I was not more than that, really. It was astounding. Maybe 3 weeks. And I felt very depressed. I was in New York City, and New York City is a very closed city, particularly in the field of theatrical entertainment, and especially in the field of humor. If you're not doing it on the stage of the Blue Angel, you're not funny. That's all there is to it. and this is the way it works. If you're not doing it on an LP with a crowd of idiots cheering you, you're not funny. That's the end of it. They just say that. And New York is the most title conscious. It's the most And I'm serious. It is the most promotion-conscious, the most publicity-conscious city that I have ever seen in the world, believe me. And I mean this. For example, in England, a good radio performer automatically is considered real fodder for the films. Peter Sellers, by the way, is basically a radio performer. Are you aware of that? So is Terry Thomas. But these people went from the radio immediately into the films. It would never happen in New York, I can tell you that. But that's beside the point. I came on here and I was working and I was very lonely, and the people here at the station could not, they had no idea what I was doing. They looked at me blankly. No, this is true. Because most people are used to the same thing in radio. They entertain by interviewing somebody, which is fine, but this is the extent of it. They'll interview somebody from another medium, or they entertain by playing a record, or they will entertain by reading the news. And incidentally, reading the news is considered entertainment in many areas of radio and television. I have to tell you that. It's a sad fact. So this kind of entertainment was difficult. It was a new kind of thing, and the engineers were looking at me blankly because it didn't fit into one of their categories. You see, the program directors here were confused, and it was like I was speaking Sanskrit in a world where people spoke pidgin English. You know, nothing came across between any of us. And I would arrive a lonely figure here. Believe me, it was very interesting. Now that I look back, I've never talked about this on the air, have I? The early days here at OR. I would arrive a lonely figure here, and you see, this is what bothered me. I had come from an area where people did understand. I had been there long enough, and they listened carefully, you see. People in New York hardly ever do. They listen carefully. New York is a much faster area, and people have to understand something in 30 seconds or whatever it is nuts. It's no good. It's a nut. That's a nut there. He's still talking, he's a nut. But why doesn't he play the record? We live such fast lives in New York that everything... Do you know that what they tell you in program worlds here? I'll tell you something. To get a program like any program on the air in New York, whether it's radio or television, you have to be able to put it in such a form that the program director or the head of the production section of an agency can get the entire program in less than 3 minutes. I'm telling you a fact. You have to be able to put your show down in such a way that he can play a record, a transcription of what you're going to do, and hear it in 3 minutes. Other than that, and get the whole thing. Other than that, he's not interested. We do it here. It has to be all there in 3 minutes. So you can imagine what a struggle I had. I mean, it's not that my stuff is long, not at all. But what it really is that it takes a great deal of listening to understand the whole aura. You see, the point that I'm making. It is a sprawling thing, and I agree. I understand this. Well, anyway, through a series of odd little circumstances, I did get on the air here, and it was just on a Saturday afternoon, and so. Don't worry about it. She's keeping it. It's all right. Don't worry. We're right up there today. So I arrived in New York, and I was very lonely, and I can't tell you how depressed I was. I was extremely depressed because immediately after I would go off the air, hundreds of New Yorkers would call up. And New Yorkers, by the way, are among the most intolerant people I've ever encountered anywhere in the world. I hate to say this, but it's true. Hundreds of don't bother with it. Hundreds of New Yorkers would call up, and they would be very indignant. What is this? What is this nutty stuff on the air here? What's all this going on here? What is this trivia stuff here? What are you Get it off. Get the record on. Get the record on. Give me the news. I want the news there. And, of course, this went on hour after hour. Well, the people here stuck with it. And then, one day, I left the studio. And this was only about 3 weeks after I had been here. I was depressed. I was earning minus $2 a week. I mean, it was nothing. It was awful. And I came out of the studio, and there was a phone call from me. And, of course, all these irritated phone calls I had not been bothering with. The program department had been taking them and handling them as best they could. And I picked up the phone because the guy says, you better talk to this one. And I picked up the phone, and there was a voice on the other end. Sort of a kind of a nasal voice. He talked like this. In a sense, he kind of said, He says, hello. And I said, hello. He said, you know, you're one of the funniest men I've ever heard in 35 years of show business. Don't go away. I said, who are you? Well, it doesn't really matter. I said, well 35 years in show business, who are you, I said, well, my name is Kaufman, but I called up to talk about your program, and I want to meet you, and I want to talk to you about something. Well, to make a long story short, it was George Kaufman. And Kaufman was a man of unusual courage. He was also a man who had, as far as I know, and in my contacts with him, which were necessarily brief, he had qualities which went beyond the problems that most of us are constantly running into. Such things as, well, rank. Such things as the little idiotic, trivial things like, well, this is something that you don't do. You know, we're always at troubles with that. Well, I was very depressed, and this was a tremendous shot in the arm to me, and Kaufman said he'd been listening for the last 2 weeks. He almost caught the first show. And so he says, come on over. Well, I visited him. I went to his apartment on Park Avenue, the one where he died in, the same apartment. It's up there on the east side, of course, and it's 1035, I think it was, around the 70s or 80s. And I got upstairs where he lived, and he lived in this apartment. And it was not sumptuous, nothing. It was a nice place, of course, but very, very small, very compact, very unpretentious. And he sat there, and I walked in, and he greeted me at the doorway. I mean, it was one of the greatest things that ever happened to me. He said, I'm sure pleased to meet you. He said, you know, I want to tell you something. Because, come on in. And he was a very frail man. He was very frail, and at that point his hair was almost completely white. And he says, would you like a drink? I said, yeah, fine. You know, I didn't know what to say. This is George Kaufman, say. And I'm the bumpkin from the Middle West, and he poured me some scotch, and he sat there. He says, you know, he says, I want to tell you something about your work. And he talked about my work for about, an hour and a half. And he says, you know, what you're doing is a kind of theater. He says, it's a different kind of theater. And he says, I'm sure that nobody's going to know that. He says, and I think you better get in the real theater, the theater that everyone understands, because they'll understand it then. And he says, I want to work with you. And he wanted to collaborate. I'm just telling you the straight story. He wanted to work on a piece that I had done on the air. He heard a piece, and he says, we ought to make a play out of that. Well, unfortunately, we had several meetings, and just at that point, he got into very bad health. He was really badly off. And he would call me every couple of weeks and say, you know, his voice got weaker and weaker. He'd say, I wish we could work, but I can't. He says, but I'll get back. And I met him several times after that, but there's one thing you've got to remember. He was a listener. He really was one of us. And every night and every Saturday, he rarely went out. He would listen. And one time he called me over. He says, you know who just got into town? I said, who? He said, well, it's a funny thing. And he proceeded to tell me about one of the Marx Brothers' wives. He said, you know, she arrived into town here last night, and she was a New Yorker. And the first thing she said is Shepard still on the air? And he says, she and I sat and we talked about things you'd done. And he says, you know, she wants to meet you. And so I went over there, and I shot the breeze with one of the Marx Brothers' wives, and we talked for about 3 or 4 hours. And we discussed FPA and all the great people who had worked here in New York in humor in days before. And the last time I saw Kaufman, I remember Kaufman standing, and this was only about 8 months ago. He was standing in the doorway. He says, you know, he said, I'm working on something. He says, when I finish it, you and I are going to work together again. He says, we're going to get working on this project. He's a wonderful man. And I was very sad to find that he had died. When I picked up the Times and saw his picture, somehow something really important went. Not because of what his work was, because his work was good, but because of his attitude and his viewpoint.